Good evening. It's great that we have a chance to be back tonight, and I'm always excited whenever we get an opportunity to continue a study like this. And this has been an exciting one for me because we've gotten to take an exploration through the book of Ruth, a book that provides a lot of information as to how to be a practical, good person, especially a practical, good person when people around you are not good, when people around you are not doing what's right and are not acting as they should. You don't see a lot of that evil specifically in the book of Ruth, but what you do see is in the book of Judges, a very evil group of people, a very evil time. Ruth, however, shines as a beacon of light in that time, as someone who is caring, someone who is loving, and someone who is faithful and able to do things that normal people would not be able to go through because of her love and faithfulness and how much she is devoted to doing what is right. The title of this evening's lesson is Boaz the Provider. We're going to be taking a little closer look at some things that Boaz has done and is doing, and we're going to get a little further along in the narrative here. Our text for this evening's lesson is Ruth chapter 2, verses 17 through 23. So if you want to go ahead and be turning over there, we'll be there in just a moment. It's exciting to me to be getting to this point in the story because the story is starting to turn around. Ruth has come home with Naomi, and things do not look really all that good. There's no husband, there's no brother-in-law, no father-in-law. They've even lost the other sister-in-law, the other daughter-in-law. After all this loss, they are left back in a land where Ruth is all alone, except for Naomi. She has no family, no one that would look after her, and no one that would care for her besides Naomi. And Naomi is, even when around her kinspeople, all alone because she has lost her husband and her 2 sons. There are relatives of Elimelech around, and Boaz, one of the people we're talking about this evening, he is one of these relatives. Boaz is a relative of Elimelech, the husband, the ex-husband, deceased husband of Naomi. Boaz appears upon the scene in this morning's lesson whenever we described Ruth going out gleaning. And when he appears on the scene, we already get a good impression of him. He has heard of Ruth and her kindness and her faithfulness and how wonderful she's been to Naomi, and he acts kindly towards her. He gives her wonderful gifts of being protected. He gives her the gift of grain, and that's going to be some of the things we're going to be looking at this evening. If you will follow along with me there in Ruth chapter 2. So she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. And she took it up and went into the city. Her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She also brought out and gave her what food she had left over after being satisfied. And her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, "The man's name with whom I work today is Boaz." And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi also said to her, "The man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers." And Ruth the Moabite said, "Besides, he said to me, 'You shall keep close by my young women until they have finished all my harvest.'" And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, lest in another field you be assaulted." So she kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvests, and she lived with her mother-in-law. Now, this evening I'm wanting us to look at the 3 provisions that Boaz gave not only to Ruth, but also by extension to Naomi as well. First, he provided food. Second, he provided hope. And third, he provided protection. Not necessarily in that order, but it's in that order that they are dealt with in our text this evening. First, he provided food. Now, it may not seem like a lot to us. We may not fully comprehend what has happened here. Ruth has gone out picking up the leftovers out of the field, gleaning out of the corners, and she has gathered what's called an ephah of barley. Now, an ephah is roughly a bushel gathered by hand in one day from the leftovers. This is not the regular workers that are gathering up out of the middle of the field. This is quite a lot for her to have done by hand. Now, this isn't a bushel before she beat it out. This is after she beat out the grain. This is after she's been to the threshing floor. That's quite a lot of grain. So the provision that was made for her by Boaz was no small thing at all. This was huge. So much so that when she does bring it home, that her mother-in-law is shocked. You gathered this much today? Not only that, she didn't just bring home this bushel of grain, or roughly a bushel of grain. She also brought home the extra food from her lunch. So here she comes packing about 30 pounds worth of grain. And she brings out after that her leftovers from her lunch, from where she had eaten to her full when Boaz said, "Come and take some of this bread and dip it in the wine and eat with us." And then she got full and had leftovers. She brought that in as well. This is quite a provision that Boaz has made. Not only for Ruth, but he's provided for her mother as well. Now, it's important to realize that a provision like this should have been what was going on. This is how a good Jew under the law would have acted, providing for the poor. Specifically even, providing for the poor of his own family. This idea of a redeemer is one that we're going to look at here in a little bit, but I'm wanting us to specifically focus in right now on how he acted just as a Jew altogether. Secondly, not only did he provide for her, not only did he provide for this young woman Ruth, he has provided for a widow and his family. Now, you may see on the screen here, I have the contrast drawn with Acts chapter 6. In Acts chapter 6, during the daily distributions in the early church in Jerusalem, there was some neglection on the part of some of the Grecian widows. Why were they neglected? Well, the Grecians that rose up seemed to think it was on behalf of the fact that they were not from Jerusalem, that they perhaps were part of the dispersion. But regardless of the purpose, they were getting neglected. And the apostles dealt with this very well. They said, "Choose out from among you men who fulfill these requirements, that were full of the Spirit, that would be good for this work, and have them to serve in the daily distributions." This might be what you call the first deacons. 7 men chose for a specific task in order to serve. The word servant literally in Greek is diakonos, or deacon. Now, what's interesting here is that this is one widow that didn't have to be neglected. This is one widow that was provided for. While it was something that a good Jew at this time should have done, that doesn't make it common practice. We have an obligation as Christians to provide for widows and orphans. In fact, the provision that Paul tells Timothy about is providing for widows, a widow who is a widow indeed, is specifically that word honor means to take care of, provide for. It's right after that he mentions that an elder that also labors in teaching is worthy of double honor because they're doing 2 jobs there. So you have a shepherd and a preacher as well. So this is not something that's outside of the realm and scope of what should normally be done by godly people. But let's remember here, when we're talking about, this is the time of the judges, when every man did what was right in his own eyes, where people were cruel, where they backstabbed one another, when no one followed God. Even the judges had humongous faults and were not altogether following God. Look at Samson of all people. Samson was a judge. But look what kind of wives he had. Look how he dealt with women in general. Look at his anger. Look how he dealt shrewdly with the Philistines of the land. Yes, God used it to accomplish His purpose, to drive the Philistines back and to let the Israelites conquer over the Philistines. But yet he was not a good person. The people of this time were not really good people. Bad things happened. And in the midst of all this, you have Boaz, this righteous man who is not only providing for the poor by leaving the corners of the field open and leaving some laying on the ground, but he sees this young Moabitess someone who would not have been looked up to by an Israelite, a widow, and he provides for her. Not only does he give enough for her, but also for her mother-in-law, who left Bethlehem to go dwell in the land of Moab, who I have no doubt the people of the city thought that by their evil actions of choosing that direction, the husband and the two sons died. Perhaps it was because they had chosen Moabite wives. Perhaps it was because they left Israel. Whatever it might have been. But I have no doubt in my mind that that's what the people of the land would have assumed. That God is punishing her for her actions. Look at some contemporaries at the time. Job. Albeit this is quite a bit earlier at Job's time. But what was the first response? What evil have you done, Job? What was your sin? What was your mistake? So, not only had Boaz provided food, but he'd also provided some hope. And this may be something that we haven't fully grasped yet, because we haven't looked deep enough into it. When Naomi questions Ruth, she asks her, "Where did you go gleaning? Whose field was it?" She asks this because it was very obvious to her that wherever she had went gleaning, this individual had taken notice of her. Because look all she came back with. She didn't come back with a normal day's gleaning. She came back with a humongous load. Enough for food for quite a long while. And when Ruth responds, she tells Naomi that it was Boaz. This gives Naomi instantly great hope. Why? What made Boaz so special? What made him stand out from others? It's interesting to me to see the response of Naomi whenever Ruth tells her who that is. In verse 20, we have the response of Naomi. And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi also said to her, "The man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers." Now there's two different parts here. First, the blessing to Boaz, because he's not forsaken the living or the dead. Now, this sort of a phrase is used often in the book of Ruth because there is kindness being shown to Naomi, to Ruth, and that is a kindness to their deceased, to their husbands, because the husbands aren't there to provide. And as any other husband in this room would say, that would be a great comfort to know that someone was looking after your family. And that was what was being done. In order to honor the dead, they were honoring the living. So they had not forgotten the living or the dead. Now there's another part to this, the redeeming part. There was another way that Boaz was honoring the dead. He was a candidate to be a redeemer. By the Levirate marriage, a close relative, usually a brother, would provide an heir for the name of his brother or close relative, so that his brother or close relative who had passed on without having a child, their name would continue. It was a shame. It was seen as shameful for the individual if they were to die without having an heir, someone to pass on their name. Even if they had nothing to get them, just so that their name would continue. It was a very big deal. And there was no one to carry on Elimelech's name. His two sons had died. They had not given any sons. There was no one to continue their name. However, Boaz could be that redeemer. He wasn't the only one. Something we'll see flesh out later in the story was there are other redeemers. There were other kinship redeemers that could step in. Yet Boaz had been so kind. You can see this flicker of hope in Naomi's eyes. He's one of our redeemers. He's taken notice of you. He likes you. He's been kind to you. He's taking care of us. He was already fulfilling a large part of the Redeemer's job without being the legal Redeemer. Now, there was another aspect to this, the Redeemer. They also would buy the land of the deceased, because each had its allotted land. Turn over with me to Deuteronomy chapter 25. Deuteronomy chapter 25. This is the specific text that deals with Levirate marriage. Beginning there in verse 5, follow along with me if you will. If brothers dwell together, and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the dead man shall not be married outside the family to a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go into her and take her as his wife, and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. And the first son whom she bears shall succeed to the name of his dead brother, that his name may not be blotted out of Israel. And if the man does not wish to take her his brother's wife, then the brother's wife shall go up to the gate of the elders and say, My husband's brother refuses to perpetuate his brother's name in Israel. He will not perform the duty of the husband's brother to me. Then the elders of the city shall call him and speak to him. If he persists, saying, I do not wish to take her, then his brother's wife shall go up to him in the presence of the elders and pull his sandal off his foot and spit in his face. And he shall answer and say, So shall it be done to the man who does not build up his brother's house. And the name of his house shall be called in Israel, the house of him who had his sandal pulled off. It was a symbol of the Levirate marriage, and to have it pulled off and to have it spit in his face was a sign that you weren't doing what was nice and kind and honorable to your house. It would have been a great shame if a name had been cut off from Israel. That was often the action taken by God when someone had done something so great and evil, such as Saul's household. His household was going to be cut off. His name would be cut off in Israel. The sons of Korah had a similar fate. Why? Because they had created a great trespass against God. It was not something that they took lightly, not something that they looked highly on. It was their duty, the honorable thing for this to happen. Now, I don't want us to get too far into this idea of a redeemer, because we're going to cover it later in the book of Ruth whenever it comes up and whenever there is a redemption that takes place. However, I want us to understand how ecstatic this must have made Naomi. Ruth might not have fully grasped what was going on here. We're not told just how much she knew about Jewish customs and Jewish law. But this was a redeemer. Someone to buy back her husband's land. Someone to provide not only a child, but also a family. She would have a family again. They would have income. It seems like he was a wealthy man that was doing pretty well, had plenty of servants in the field, and was able to provide quite a bit extra to Ruth. So it was obviously was not stone poor. Not only had Boaz done a great, wonderful deed in providing them food, but whether he knew it or not, he had provided them both with quite a lot of hope. And he didn't just stop there. He went on and he provided protection. Now, this is something we touched on a little bit this morning, but now we get a little more information and directly how Naomi views this protection that has been provided by Boaz. Some of the more information we get is that when Ruth is explaining to Naomi what happened, she explains that she was told by Boaz that for the rest of the harvest time, not just that day, but for the rest of the harvest time, she's to remain in that field with those men and with his young women, perhaps his servants' girls and their daughters, that he was supposed to glean with them. Why? Well, back in this morning's lesson, we talked about how he was providing protection for her. Because, once again, this is an evil time in Israel. This is not when good people are roaming the land. This is when evil things are going on. And you have specific instances riddled throughout the Judges where evil things were done to women. Horrible things. Specifically, the Levite's concubine comes to mind. Now, while this concern was there, it was removed by Boaz. He said, stay here. Stay around my servants. Stay in my field where you'll be protected. I've told my servants not to touch you. I've told them to keep you safe. This was a big load off Naomi's chest. She even mentioned specifically that she might have been injured, attacked, had she went to a different place. And it was so wonderful that she was allowed to stay there. Read with me there in verse 22 of chapter 2 in Ruth. And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, It is good, my daughter, that you go with his young women, lest in another field you be assaulted. She could have very well have been raped in another field, taken as someone else's wife, or even merely a servant in their house, a concubine. That was not at all out of the cultural milieu it would have been expected. In fact, it was expected both by Naomi and by Boaz. That's why they admired this protection and set up this protection. We may not understand completely because we say, well, kids stay around the house because there is a possibility that, something bad could happen. Don't ever go up to a stranger's car because every once in a while that happens. Well, this isn't the same case as in the time of the judges. This wasn't just every once in a while this could happen. Every man was doing what was right in his own eyes. There was no global police system. There was no Israel's police system. People got away with murder all the time. People got away with rape, with stealing all the time. It's horrible that things like that happened, but it's something that's necessary for us to understand in order to really grasp what's going on here. Boaz, while he did provide protection, while he did provide them with food and sustenance, the greatest thing he provided for them is the greatest gift anyone can ever be given, and that's hope. A life without hope is one that's meaningless. A life that has no hope has no purpose, no reason to go on, to continue, to strive. Why would you? There's no hope for anything better. There's no hope for anything. Whenever Ruth is talked about, and specifically the Redeemer, Jesus is a common topic to be brought up with it, as is natural anytime talking about the Bible, but specifically with this idea of the Redeemer. Why? Because Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah, the Redeemer. He is our Redeemer. He is the one that has bought us, that is providing for us, that is protecting us. He is the one that gives us hope, that gives us a reason to go on. If there was no hope of eternal salvation, if we had to go to Judgment Day and just answer for all the bad things that we've done, knowing that everyone's a sinner, everyone's unrighteous, there's not even a righteous person that walks the face of the earth, is how Proverbs puts it. Knowing that, why would we live good? Why wouldn't we just do what was right in our own eyes, as they did in the time of Judges? Why wouldn't I do what just made me feel good, what I enjoyed? There'd be no reason to have any moral code. That's what gets so scary when we talk to individuals who do not believe there is inherent morality. Specifically when you deal with those that don't believe there is any higher power, any God of any kind, anyone that's atheist or some flavor is that, they have no reason for morality. They try to hold on to this and they try to grasp it, but they have no reason to. If there is no hope, then there's no purpose to do anything. There's no motivation to do anything. It's a wonderful blessing that we have hope. The Hebrew writer said, let us with confidence draw near to the holy place. Why? Because the priests at that time, they were scared. There are these old Jewish rabbinic rumors of a rope being tied around the high priest so that if when he went into the most holy place, if he was struck dead by God for not being purified as he ought to be, he could be pulled out. There are rumors that the bells on the tassels of their clothing was so that you could hear the bells and know that they were still alive and walking around. Now those are just rabbinic traditions and rabbinic rumors, but they give this right idea. In that same Hebrew letter towards the end, when he's describing the kingdom that we have, what kind of kingdom does he say we've come to? It's not one that's like the fiery mountain, Mount Horeb. It's not one that people were so scared to even touch or to look at because the commandment was, if you touch it, you'll die. We've not come to that kind of a kingdom. We can with confidence draw near. Why? Because it's not based on my works. It's based on my faith in God's grace. It's based on my obedience. It's based on my submission to God. This evening, the purpose that we are here is to always to glorify God. But it's to check ourselves. Every time we come together, wherever it may be, and we sing songs of praise to God, we pray asking Him for blessings and asking for His provision. When we open up this book of His and try to gather lessons out, it should always be checking ourselves. We should always be searching the Scriptures to see if what's being said is the truth. We should always be examining ourselves to see if we match up with what we see there. To see if we are acting as kind and noble as Boaz. To see if we are acting as faithful as Ruth. Or to see if, like the people at the time of the judges, we're doing what's right in our own eyes. This evening, if you're here and you don't find yourself somewhere that you like, let me go a step further. If you don't find yourself somewhere that God likes, don't go home and think, well, I'll be all right. He doesn't demand perfection, but He demands the whole heart. If your heart is troubling you this evening, don't walk out those doors. Come right now while we stand and sing together.